Welcome back. We're going to do the next part of chapter 1, so chapter 1 part 2. So when we left Charlie and Betty, they had just started going trick-or-treating with a stern warning from Granny that they were to stay on the green. But I've got a feeling that Betty has other things in mind. So let's find out what these girls are up to. With another glance back at the inn, she took Charlie's sleeve and urged her forwards towards the lane. This way, I've got a surprise for you. A surprise? Charlie looked up at her, wide-eyed. But you told Granny that we're only going around the green. You said, I know what I said. And Betty shepherded Charlie in front. But you and I are about to have a little adventure, which is why I need you to keep this our secret. Can you do that? Now Charlie gave a mischievous, gappy grin between chews. She nodded, her pigtails bobbing. What kind of adventure? Well, we are going to Marshford. Jumping jackdaws! Charlie's huge green eyes suddenly looked even huger. Marshford? But that's on the ferry. Yes, it is. Betty patted her pocket, feeling the weight of 3 coins there. It had taken her weeks to scrape together the return ferry fare at the cost of a silver raven each. She had managed it by saving the small amount of pocket money Granny allowed them, as well as whatever she came across when she was sweeping the floor of the poacher's pocket. She'd hoarded every coin, rooks and feathers. They all added up, and now that Fliss wasn't coming, there was money to spare. But Betty, we'll get caught. Not this time. That's what you always say before something goes wrong. Charlie had a point there, but Betty wasn't to be deterred. Look, I've got it all figured out. She was so confident that she'd even thought up a new motto, but she was saving that. Well, what if Granny does find out? Charlie whispered, half gleeful and half afraid. We'll be in for it. She won't, Betty said. Why do you think I've chosen tonight? Everyone's going to be dressed up or wearing masks. It's perfect. If no one else knows it's us, then no one can rat on us to Granny. Well, what's in Marshford? Charlie asked. Bigger houses? More sweets? Better than that, Betty cooed, shooed Charlie further down the darkened lane. It has got a fairground, bobbing apples and soul cakes, and a prize for the best costume, and, best of all, candy floss. And adventure, that she added in silent defiance. She didn't care where they escaped to, as long as it was out of Crowstone. Marshford was both far enough away to be satisfyingly daring and new, and close enough to get away with it. Sneaking off to the unknown felt like scratching an itch that had been there all her life. Candy floss, Charlie breathed, since she'd lost her front teeth. Her sweet little voice had a slight lisp to it. She slipped a hot, sticky hand into Betty's. But it's so far away. What if we don't make it back in time for cake? Oh, we'll make it back easy, said Betty. I've got it all planned, and they're not going to eat my birthday cake without me. But hurry, we've only got a few minutes now before the ferry leaves. They slipped further down the lane, rounding the corner. Beneath the mask, Betty grinned triumphantly, her heart racing. They were really going to do it. They would really finally get to see what life was beyond Crowstone. And all because of her. Betty loosened the cloak around her neck and they started to run. Beside her, Charlie counted the glowing jack-o'-lanterns and carved turnips in the windows, pointing out one that she'd made yesterday, which was on the school steps. They followed them along the cobbled streets like wraiths, leading them to the misty marshes. Soon the houses became fewer, and then the crossroads were in sight, and there were no houses at all. Instead, some distance away across the marshes, rows of tiny prison cell windows glowed yellow, like watchful eyes in the blackness. Raising higher Another light flickered from the solitary tower that loomed over the rest of the building. Charlie now slowed to a walk, and they sidestepped to allow a couple of people hurrying to the ferry to pass. "How long has father been there now?" she asked. "Charlie," Betty scolded, hoping those in front hadn't heard. She lowered her voice. 2 years, 8 months. She paused, rummaging through the dates in her head. "And 4 days." "How long till he gets out?" Betty sighed, feeling a familiar mixture of emotions at the thought of their father. Sadness, frustration, disappointment. Like their mother's death, his absence had hit Betty and Fliss harder than it had hit Charlie. Even if Barney Widdershins was, in Granny's own words, a useless tow rag, Betty couldn't help feel some sort of loyalty towards him. He wasn't much of a father, but he was the only one that they had. 2 years, 3 months and 26 days, she answered Charlie, finally. "Why are you whispering?" Charlie asked. She'd only been 3 when their father was taken away, and the lack of contact since meant that she never really had been too close to him. "Merely curious. You're always telling Fliss there's no point in getting embarrassed about him being in there." "Embarrassed," Betty corrected. If they lived anywhere else, she would have squirmed about it, but almost everyone who lived near the prison did so because they were related to somebody on the inside. "No, there isn't, but I don't blab about personal stuff when we're meant to be undercover. You never know who's listening. Now, get a move on. I can see the ferry waiting." "Oh." Charlie grinned and pulled her witch's hat a bit lower on her head, clearly enjoying being up to no good. Betty ran ahead, with Charlie scampering behind her. Betty had a fixed gaze on the prison. Which cell was father's? From there it was impossible to tell. Prisoners often moved. He might not even be in the same cell now, not that Betty would know. It was 6 months since Granny had taken Fliss and Betty with her to the visit. Apparently their father had claimed he was too miserable and ashamed to see his daughters or even respond to their letters. Betty glared at the prison. Well, he should have thought of that before he got himself pinched. She gave the prison a last scowl before looking away, determined not to let her father ruin tonight, like he'd ruined everything else. They reached the ferry, running the last few steps. Evidently the fog warning hadn't changed for the worst, as the ferryman appeared unconcerned about the wispy mist that was now wreathing around the boat. There was a handful of costumed people on it already, who also appeared to be heading for the Halloween fair. Betty paid their fares and then squeezed onto the narrow seat next to Charlie. She glanced gleefully back to where they had come. Had they really got away with it? It had been so easy. Still, she tapped her toe impatiently until the ferryman finally pushed off, and then they were gliding over the water. "Adventure awaits the audacious," Betty whispered in excitement. It was the first time she had spoken her new motto aloud. She had been dying to say that all day. Charlie was unimpressed. "What colour candy floss do you think they'll have?" "Green, perhaps, or orange," Betty tailed off, staring back to shore. A little way along from the ferry was the harbour, and somewhere among the boats was their own, a ramshackle ensemble of rotting wood that their father had won in a bet, and had been trying to fix up ever since, without success. Perhaps he never would. For once, Betty didn't really care. She didn't need father or a boat for adventures. Here on the marshes by night, she wasn't just the middle Widdershin sister, plain and blunt against Fliss's prettiness and charm, and sensible next to Charlie's cuteness and mischief. Here she was Betty the brave, Betty the explorer. She could go anywhere, do anything. Everything looked different, more eerie and mysterious, and in the distance she could see the strange flickering lights, like magic orbs, hovering above the water's surface. People call them will-o'-wisps. Some said they were the souls of those who had died on the marshes. Others believed they were mysterious sprites trying to lead the travellers astray. As she stared towards the prison, they would pass the first, located on the island of Repent, which was one of 3 nearby craggy isles on the marshes. The second island was a small island known as Lament, where all of the Crowstone's dead were buried. Betty had been there only once, recently when her mother had died shortly after Charlie had been born. A pang of sadness crept over her at the memory, still raw even now. And the final island was called Torment. Now this was out of bounds for those who lived on the mainland Crowstone. Those on Torment had been exiled, people who had been released from the prison but still had punishment to serve by not being allowed to return to the mainland, or those who had committed crimes not serious enough to be locked away for, but enough to warrant being banished. Collectively, the 3 places were still part of Crowstone and were known as the Sorrow Isles. Along with the mainland Crowstone, they were all the girls had ever known, and the farthest any of them had ever travelled. Tonight, after all, Betty's longing was about to change. It was her birthday gift to herself, she decided. A step towards life she wanted, one of the opportunities, adventures, one where she could have golden sand crusted under her fingernails instead of coal dust. The boat had not gone too far when Betty became aware that something was happening. Now the misty marshes were living now up to their name. The prison lights vanished. Instead, all she could see was a thick, swirling grey mist. It was curling around them now, chilling their bones. Her scalp prickled with dread. A mother sitting opposite drew her small son closer and muttered something in concern. "Betty," Charlie tugged at her sleeve. "What if the boat gets lost, or we can't find our way back from Marshfoot?" Betty swallowed. Granny had used many excuses over the years to avoid taking the girls too far, but now those warnings came flooding back. "We could miss the return ferry. Lost boats have struck rocks and sunk into the marshes. People say there's still slavers in these parts, just waiting to snatch people away and sell them." Suddenly, Betty didn't feel so smart or brave. She now felt rather silly and worried. "It's getting hard to see," the lady with the young boy called to the ferryman. "Aye," he grunted. "May just be a pocket. If it don't clear in a minute, we'll have to turn back." Charlie's bottom lip wobbled. But my candy floss." Betty didn't answer, fighting to appear calm for her sister's sake. Perhaps Granny hadn't been too cautious. Perhaps she was right to be afraid. The temperature now plummeted as the thick, freezing fog wrapped around the boat, frighteningly fast. This wasn't a pocket. It was all around them. Now the ferryman stopped rowing, lifting his lantern. Betty felt Charlie's small hand reaching for hers. She wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders and lifted her free hand in front of her face. It was almost touching her nose before she could see it. A huge bump rocked the boat. There were screams and gasps as it rocked dangerously on the water. "What's happening?" Charlie's voice was high-pitched with fear. Her fingers dug into Betty's palm painfully. "I don't know," gasped Betty, clutching the side of the boat. Freezing water slopped over her elbow. "Did we hit a rock?" "I want to go home," Charlie wailed, all thoughts of candy floss now forgotten. The boat lurched again as a familiar figure loomed over the 2 girls. Betty gave a squeak of surprise as someone pushed their face into hers, almost nose to nose. "Good," said Granny, "because home is exactly where we are going." Oh. Now, my question to you for your little task is, was Granny on the boat before they pushed off? And if not, how did Granny get onto the boat? I think Betty and Charlie are in a little bit of trouble. Catch up with me next time, and we're going to start chapter 2. And chapter 2 is entitled Prisoners. I'll see you later.